Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Nahmaduhu wa nusalli ala rasulihil kareem amma ba'd fa'auzu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem bismillahir rahmanir rahim. I welcome you to program Understanding Quran, the Word of Allah, and this is Dr. Kanwal Kaisser. Alhamdulillah, we have reached till Juz 10 and we are still on Surah Al-Anfal. And just a reminder that Surah Al-Anfal is about the time frame when it was Battle of Badr. And very amazingly, we find out that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not only giving us the glimpses of this Battle of Badr and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's help came for the Muslims, but at the very same time, there is a lot of grooming which is taking place for the Muslim. So in this Juz 10, we start with verse number 41, Surah Al-Anfal. وَعَلَمُوا أَنَّ مَا غَنِمْتُم مِّن شَيْءٍ فَأَنَّ لِلَّهِ خُمُسَهُ وَلِلرَّسُولِ وَلِذِي الْقُرْبَى وَالْيَتَامَى وَالْمَسَاكِينِ وَابْنِ السَّبِيلِ. Know that 1/5 of the booty, that is the spoils of the war, is for Allah, His Rasul, close relatives of the Rasul, orphans, the needy, and the people who are on their way, the travelers. If you do believe in Allah and in what we revealed to our servant on the day of this distinction, the day when the two enemies met in combat, Allah has power over everything. Now imagine the question was asked at the very beginning of the surah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talked about the events and how the Muslims have to have reliance on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and what are the traits that the Muslims should have. And that's when we have been now told about the spoils of the war. Very amazingly, again, you find out that the system that Islam has is, it's not a time of looting, that whoever is there can grab whatever he or she can. No. There is a proper system of how this booty, the spoils of war, are going to be distributed, and there is a proper justice system on that. Then we move down to verse number 45, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, addresses the believers. Ya ayyuhallazina amanu, O believers, iza laqitum fiyatan fasbutu waskurullaha kasiran la'allakum tuflihun. O believers, when you encounter an enemy in a combat, be firm and frequently remember Allah so that you may be successful. Can you imagine, in a battlefield situation, we have been told about two important things, which is, number one, we have to be firm. We have to be steadfast in our actions, in our lifestyle, in our commitment to the cause, because this attribute is something which we feel is one area which probably people always sit around and say, well, you know, I always start something with a lot of motivation and zeal, but somehow my graph goes down immediately or after a couple of days to a month time. You will also feel this thing happening to you immediately after the month of Ramadan. So we need to identify some inconsistent patterns in our life, because as it's said, slow and steady wins the race. And this is exactly the thing that we have been told in Islam to follow. Take baby steps and be persistent on those steps. A lot of places where we show this inconsistent patterns, like we start a project and then it fizzles out. We keep changing institutions, one university, one school, one college. We keep changing we're not fixed about our career choices. We want to do one thing and then another thing, and then we're totally lost and confused. So how we can bring in this consistency in our life? Create schedules, and once you create schedules, put up reminders for yourself, and then learn to reward yourself when you are consistent in a different area. Try also to avoid chaos in your life, and yes, there has to be a purpose attached to whatever you do. And I was surprised when I read that many experts say, if you want to be consistent and steadfast in your life, be mindful. And amazingly, again, subhanallah, we have been given 5 times prayer to be mindful, where we are totally focused in developing our connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And experts also talk about sleep patterns. If you have a sound sleep, if you sleep on the right time, then you will automatically have this personality in which you are trying to be consistent in your activities. Now, if you adopt an Islamic lifestyle, you will notice that many of these things will come automatically to you. And then the next verse moves on to guide us further on how we groom ourselves. Okay, over here, after being consistent, it was waskurullaha kasiran. You have to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not just couple of times, kasiran. Kasiran is the time that has been mentioned over here. And how's that? وَأَطِيعُوا wa Rasul. And you have to obey Allah and the Messenger, and do not argue with one another. Now, in a situation when you're so stressed out, it is battlefield, and you are facing the army, you're facing your enemy, it has been told, وَنَا تَنَازَعُوا فَتَفْشُلُوا, that do not argue with one another, lest you will lose your courage and your strength will come down. And ultimately the conclusion is, Inna Allaha ma'as sabirin. Allah is always with those people who do sabr. So we have been given the best combo over here. This combo has remember Allah, this combo has teamwork principles, and this combo has something how we work on our personalities inside rather than focusing on all the factors which are around us. We move on and we come down to the verses where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is guiding us towards about those people, another important principle. This is in verse number 53. And you might have heard this verse many a times around you, where it is said, ذَلِكَ بِأَنَّ اللَّهَ لَمْ يَكُنْ مُغَيِّرًا نِعْمًا أَنْعَمَهَا عَلَى قَوْمٍ حَتَّى يُغَيِّرُوا مَا بِأَنفُسِهِمْ وَأَنَّ اللَّهَ سَمِيعٌ عَلِيمٌ. This is because Allah has never changed the blessing which He has bestowed on the people until they themselves change the condition of their souls. Verily, Allah hears all and knows all. So the important message over here is, if we want to have change in the society, if we want to have change in the systems around us, you know, what's the starting point? Us, me. If I start working on myself, then ultimately these small building blocks, when they come together and they form a big society, then the effects are going to go down to everyone. So if we want anything to be fixed, let's look at ourselves in the mirror. Then again, as we move on, we find out that in verse number 59 onwards, again a very important concept has been given. So far, I am sure you must have noticed that we have covered like 9 days of Ramadan. And each day we find out that Islam focuses on the concept of love, concept of empathy, compassion, peace. These are the messages which are the key areas for in a life of any Muslim. But it doesn't mean that we take up the cruelty of the people around, or it doesn't mean that we get oppressed or suppressed by other people. That is why we have been told over here that we need to have enough courage to stand up for ourselves as well. And the verse says, muster against them all the military strength and cavalry that you can afford, so that you may strike terror in the hearts of the enemy of Allah and of yours and others besides them who are unknown to you, but they are known to Allah. Remember that whatever you will spend in the cause of Allah shall be paid back to you in full, and you shall not be treated unjustly. So Muslims are not supposed to be cowards. Muslims are not supposed to be doormat. Muslims are not supposed to be yes man to all forms of atrocities that take place for them as well as for the ummah or the people around in the world. So we have been told to have a certain standing in different places, obviously according to the scenario. Verse number 64 talks about another important aspect. Ya Yuhan Nabi, O Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, hasbukallah. Allah is all sufficient for you. Wa man ittaba'aka minal mu'minin, and for the believers who follow you. So for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it's Allah. He is guided by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is helped by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then we come down to the believers. For believers, the important principle is we need to follow the Prophet. Where and how? In our daily chores. Whatever you do, you have to see what's the sunnah way of doing it. And then you need to follow all the habits of the Prophet ﷺ. And yes, we are talking about the war times. So even in the war, there is a reminder that all the Muslims have to follow a long list of things that we need to do and we need to avoid even in the situation when you are in the battlefield. So With all this, we find out, we move on to verse number 70 and 71, and these are the beautiful verses. They talk about the kindness to the prisoners of war. O Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, tell the captives in your custody, if Allah finds goodness in your heart, He will give you even better than what has been taken from you, as well as forgive you. Allah is forgiving and He is merciful. But if they have treacherous designed against you, O Prophet, they have already shown treason against Allah. That is why Allah made them your captives, and Allah is knowledgeable and wise. So there is a firm grounding and clarity on how you deal with the people. And obviously, you cannot torture, you cannot put them in the torture cells, or you blow their mind away by using all those such techniques. So the verses move down, and we talk about in verse number 72, Inna allazina amanu wa hajaru wa jahadu bi amwalihim wa anfusihim fi sabilillah. Those who believed and migrated and made jihad with their wealth and their person in the cause of Allah, as well as those who have given them asylum and help, are indeed the protecting friends of one another. Beautiful traits have been identified over here. The first and foremost, you need to have Iman, because whatever you do without Iman, it loses its grounding, because then you're only doing it for either your own self, you become self-centered, or you're doing it under the pressure of society. When you are being Allah conscious, then you cannot take away or erode the right of other people around you. And then you migrate. The first migration is leaving your bad habits and fixing yourself, and then your jihad, which is your inner struggle as well as the battlefield situation. So your inner struggle is with your desires, with your anger, with your emotion, with your negativity, where you are not able to fulfill the rights and responsibilities, where you're not taking care of the important areas in your life. And that is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala especially talks about it over here, that we need to work on ourselves if we want changes and if we want improvement in the society. Now we move on to the next surah in Juz 10, and this is a surah which is of very prime importance. And today what I wanted to do was, rather than going into too much detail of the verses, I would like to give you a bird's eye view of this surah, because this is a surah which is probably most interpreted. This is a surah which is always in the focus of the worldwide whenever people are talking about, and this is a surah which needs, where we need to understand the background of the surah, the background of the verses, the background of all the things that have been explained over here, and that is Surah Tawbah. So if you look at Surah Tawbah, this is like the flip side of Surah Al-Anfal, and it is talking about, where in Surah Al-Anfal we are talking about Battle of Badr, and yes, it is also about the wartime and the different things, that the commandments which have been given to the Muslims related to the war situation. But when we talk about Surah Tawbah, this is the time of expedition of Tabuk, and this happened around the 9th year of Hijrah, and that is the time when the people have been told to come back towards the repentance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, before we go into any further details of this surah, let's look at, or let's try to understand the scenario at that moment. Because whenever we study a verse or we study a surah or anything from Quran, number one thing, we have to relate it to the times of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We have to understand why this particular ayah, in what context these verses were revealed. And then we take up the same model and then pick it up and apply it in our life. And then we see what are the different scenarios, very similar scenarios in my life as well, and how I can apply the same principles over here. Because if you're picking up a model from one situation and applying it into a totally different situation, that's when either you are going to misinterpret the verses, or you are not going to be able to apply them properly, and you will get confused yourself. So let us try to look into Battle of Tabuk. What was that? This came after Hijrah, and this was the time when the Muslims were very well settled, and this place, Tabuk, is closer to the Jordan border. And there were two superpowers at that time. One was the Byzantine and the other was Persian power. And now the Byzantines, what they did was they decided to attack the Muslims. Because again, if we go back into the history, we find out that these superpowers, they had never been concerned about what was happening in Arab Peninsula. It was like Bedouins living over there. It was like a total desert, nomadic kind of lifestyle was there. So people would only pass through this place for their business trips and caravans. For them, it was like a no man's zone. They were least bothered about it. Suddenly they saw this another threat coming to them in the form of a power with a lot of unity. They were less in number, but somehow there were some characteristics in them which made them really specialized. So all the focus of the world was on this particular, this ummah which was emerging. So the Byzantines, they wanted to attack the Muslims. Muslims, they were not at all in that time frame, mental frame, physical frame to pick up a fight. Why? Because it was summer, it was hot, they had just come back from Hajj, and it was for them the worst time to pick up a fight, and especially with the world superpower. Now, the Prophet ﷺ was facing multiple challenges. The superpower is attacking them. Then there are a lot of hypocrites, and the hypocritical behavior was becoming more challenging for them. Then at the very same time, we find out there were some tribes, they were going against or back on their treaties. So the Prophet ﷺ had to deal with them as well. And he had to look around at the morale of his ummah, because especially they were badly affected by the hypocrites which were there in the society. In Anfal, we find out that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala specially guided Muslims to be steadfast on their iman, on their belief system, on their emotions, on their consistent patterns, healthy patterns in their life. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guided them that this is when they are going to have all the blessings coming from Him. Now, when we move on to Surah Tawbah, they are like, coming in continuation, but it is important, as I said, to understand not only the context of this surah, but also the key messages that are around this surah. This is a surah which begins, this is the only surah in Quran which does not begin with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So let's say you open up Quran, because every time this is the etiquette manner which we have been told that whenever you open Quran and you start recitation of Quran, you start with A'udhu Billahi Minash Shaitanir Rajim and Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. But we have been told that if you open Quran and today you were supposed to recite Surah Tawbah, you are only going to recite A'udhu Billahi Minash Shaitanir Rajim. Why? Why so? For one reason, the Prophet ﷺ advised the companions when they were organizing all the surahs and the verses that they are not going to be writing Bismillah Rahmanir Rahim. Why? Because this was told to him by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because he was following the commandments of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Again, we come to the same question, why? Because the commandments which were coming in this surah told us, or it's like sort of a signal that this is a surah which is not going to show you compassion. This is a surah in which you will not experience mercy. This is a surah which is uncompromising. The time has come in which there has to be a straight table talk. There has to be my way or the highway kind of a thing, because a lot of time has gone and a lot of time has been given to the mushrikeen and the people of Makkah and the hypocrites and the people around from other divine religions. And the Muslims, they need to take a firm stand. We also find out that the word Tawbah, the repentance, has been used 16 times in surah, and 13 times it has been used in Surah Al-Baqarah. So with this background, let us try to look into further details. What does this surah talk about? Because this surah has a lot of unique qualities. And as I said earlier, you need to understand the context in which it was revealed. You need to look into the verses before it, and then you need to also look at the verses which will come after it. Sort of you need to have a bird's eye view of everything, because if you try to just pick any verse out of context, and inshallah I'm going to talk about a couple of the verses that you will hear from the non-Muslims or Islamophobes on the media, where they're so scared and they they portray Islam as a religion of terrorism, whereas this surah would tell you, if you look at all the background and study it deeply, that it's not about terrorism. So we do understand this is a surah which is minus the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what we need to understand is that if we have read about so many other surahs, and we have seen the pattern in history how the prophets, they came and they conveyed the message to the people. Some of them listened and some of them rejected those messages. But ultimately what happened, once the prophet moved out, then the whole nation was destroyed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because their time had come. It was like the time was gone away. They had been given repeated warning, repeated and ample time to improve themselves. Now, for the Muslims, we find out that this did not happen with the Quraysh. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have easily told the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, now you move out with all the believers and let me destroy the Quraysh. No, the Quraysh for some reason had been given the time, the warning, and they had been told that now is the time that either you come to this religion or you move out from this place. So the basic goal with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was he had to cleanse Makkah, and once the local cleansing was done, it was time for him to expand his horizons towards the international level. So that's how the surah begins, and that's how we find out that how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is guiding in a very beautiful manner and organized manner, with minimum bloodshed, with lot of tolerance towards those people. Imagine that the Quraysh were there after this warning to leave this place or join the Ummah for almost a year. And in that time, yes, there were no idols in Kaaba, but these people, they were allowed to come and do the pilgrimage of the Kaaba. So the Muslims had been showing immense tolerance even in these times. And we see that if we compare the whole situation with the modern times, what do we see? We see that if there is a terrorist, if there is someone who had been abusing you, has been abusing the authority, had been creating a problem for the community, and also not only the community, there are also been people who are, let's say, creating problems for the whole not only nation but at the world level. What would you do? What would anyone do? What would a superpower do? We all are aware of this fact that they are going to nail them down. They are not going to give them any liberty or any margin beyond certain warnings. So this is the kind of the scenario that the Muslims had. We also understand that was the time when the mushrikeen, the non-believers, they had broken that Hudaybiyah treaty. Remember that treaty? It's a beautiful treaty, and because of that there was peace for around 10 years. Now Abu Sufyan, he was going around from home to home and trying to convince people that maybe we can work it out again, and we are sorry, because they saw that the Muslims, they were now in a different frame of mind. They were not ready to negotiate any further. It's like when you say, I'm done with this whole situation. But, and why they were done with this whole situation? Remember, look at the track record of them. If you look at the people of Quraysh and Makkah, what did they do to the Muslims? Again, I would tell you, please open up a seerah book and go over everything and try to place yourself in that situation. They would mock, they would ridicule, they would kill, they would torture, and they kicked them out, the Muslims from Makkah. And when the Muslims came back on the conquest of Makkah, again we find out minimum bloodshed, and they were there and they were living peacefully. So we find out that when these verses were revealed, Abu Bakr Siddiq radhiyallahu anhu had left for Hajj. And when these verses came, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam sent Ali radhiyallahu anhu to go and tell Abu Bakr Siddiq that this has come as, let's say, a domestic policy which has to be implemented. So over here we also find out, because in these verses will be talked about the jihad and yes, the fighting. So let's try to understand these two terminologies as well. One term is jihad and the other term that we use is qital. What's the difference between them? Jihad is struggle. It could be applied on the battlefield situation where you're fighting your enemy, or it could be your inner struggle when you are fighting your nafs, your own soul, your own desires, or it could be your worldly affairs where you're trying to streamline yourself. So it's like it's a struggle that you're making, and jihad is usually called the inner or utmost struggle that you make. Now, qital is one category of this jihad in which what you do is you actually are in the battlefield and you're facing the enemy. I would always advise all the Muslims that whenever somebody is talking to you in any place at an international level and asking about jihad, because the moment we utter the word jihad, we look around everywhere. Am I being scanned for it? Am I going to be held accountable for it? No, it's nothing like that. We have made it into a bad word, but it's not a bad word. What we need to understand about it is that yes, we have this option, like in the worldly affairs, we all have this option to not only manage such affairs, but also take a stand for yourself when you feel you're going to be oppressed or you're going to be attacked by your enemy. You have to be fully prepared for that. And remember that when we look at the different accounts that we read in Quran, it was in the times of Musa alayhi salam that we read about qital, when the Bani Israel, the Pharaoh drowned and they were out of that place, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has bestowed his blessings on them. That's the time when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told them to go to this place where the people were suffering and help them through qital. And we remember the whole story that they were lazy and they didn't want to go, and they were looking up for all the excuses that how could we sort of get out of this thing. So the bottom line is what we need to understand: whenever a law is there and a law is broken, there have to be consequences for that. You don't tie up, you don't buckle up, you are going to be given the warning for that. Then you break into someone's house, you are again going to be accountable for that. So with this whole background, we would like to now look into some of the verses and some of the key concepts that are coming in Surah Tawbah. Okay? But over here, we'll take a short break and then move on with the surah. Welcome back. We are on the 10th juz and Surah Tawbah, and I have just given you the background, a very strong background of Surah Tawbah, the context in which it came out. So we understand that this is a surah which was revealed in the 9th year of Hijrah, and it has 3 different discourses. The first discourse was revealed in Zilqa'dah, in which there was a policy which was given out for the mushrikeen. Then the second discourse was revealed in the month of Rajab, which was basically dealing with the expedition of Tabuk. And then the third discourse was revealed upon the Prophet ﷺ once there was a return from this battle of Tabuk. And remember this thing, this is a small reminder for all of you who haven't gone through the seerah, that the battle of Tabuk actually did not happen. Somehow the Byzantine Empire, they retrieved back without picking up on the Muslims. So the Muslims also came back. But there were a lot of learning and a lot of messages, and inshallah today and tomorrow as well, as we move on into the surah, we are going to be talking about that. So Surah Tawbah doesn't begin with Bismillah. It's a magnificent surah. This is a surah which teaches us to become fearless, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is also teaching us about becoming courageous in all different situations. Another name for this surah is Bara, in which it means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has disowned all the people who are not coming into that domain. So we start this surah, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bara'um minallahi wa rasuli ila allazina ahadtum minal mushrikeen. A declaration of immunity from Allah and His Rasul is hereby made to those of the mushrikeen with whom you have made a treaty. So now we have been, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is declaring that now the situation is different and the rulings and the ground rulings are also going to be different. I've also come across people who say it's so unfair. Islam is a religion of love, and why can't there be forgiveness? Why can't we allow these people to go beyond that boundary and still explore the beauty and the dimensions of Islam? Now, remember this thing, this is a rule, a universal rule that we apply everywhere. You apply for a visa to a certain country, they have a right to refuse your visa. We come across countries in which they do not allow you immigration. They have the rulings for the immigration. Similarly, if you try to expand it to the Ummah, we have to understand that there are certain rulings which have been given to us as believers, and this is for our own protection. This is a system that we have to accept, and we have to let other people accept around as well. So, in the verse number 4, if you look at it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala condemns those people who have broken the treaties. As I told you, this is the time to not to give them any further chances. Ample time had been given to them. 13 years before Hijrah, 9 years after Hijrah, and now they are the ones who have to straighten up themselves, because Islam is about spreading out peace. If there are people who are always corrupting the system, bringing in issues, it becomes very difficult to bring them back into the norms. We come down to verse number 5, and let me remind you, this is a favorite verse of all the people who want to talk about Islam as a religion of spreading war and terrorism, and it's a favorite verse of all the Islamophobes, where it says that kill them wherever you find them. And many times we see it on the social media that there are people who haven't read Quran, who haven't understood Quran, who haven't gone through this Surah Tawbah with all the context that I have told you, and even all the dimensions, and they say, look, there's a verse in your divine scripture which says kill the people around. But again, understand in what context it has been talked about. This is about a specific group. This is about those people who have broken the treaties. This is about those people who have been given ample chances. It's not about general masses who never got the message, who have got nothing to do with any problem around. And that is why we also find out this is again a message which is given in the time of war. It's not like in the peaceful times or in the peaceful communities that you go and just open up your gun to anyone or just start killing the people who are around, who are engaged in their day-to-day chores. So otherwise we find out that Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, if you look at his behavior, he had exemplary character, not only for the believers but also for the non-believers. We find out how he used to treat the non-believers, how he used to take good care of them and provide them protection and give them ample chances for the same justice system. So these are the verses which are misused, and we should not get offended by the people who are talking about it, and we should also not come into this defensive mode. We need to tell them, let's look into the background of these verses and then try to understand them. So in the verses to come, again, the people who are maintaining their treaty, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides the Muslims that keep protecting them and give them the space, and if they are within that zone that they listen to you, then give them time so that they can move out from that area. Verse number 17, it again talks about a very beautiful concept. Innama ya'muru masajidillah man amana billahi wal yawmil akhir wa aqamus salah wa atuz zakah wa lam yakhsha illallah fa asa ulaika an yakunu minal muhtadin. Now over here we are getting the solution. Solution to what? Solution to who is supposed to take care of masajid, the houses of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the places of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the mosque of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what is that? The mosque of Allah should be maintained by those who believe in Allah. Then and the last day, and establish salah and pay zakah and fear none except Allah. It is they who are expected to follow the true guidance. This is the bottom line for us, that wherever there are houses of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the people who manage them, who take care of them, have to follow these guidelines, have to be within this domain. Why? Because masajid are the places to rejuvenate, masajid are the places to reconnect with each other. So they have to be within that peaceful boundary and parameters. Then we move on and we come down to verse number 20, in which again the concept has been highlighted. Allazina amanu wa hajaru wa jahadu fi sabilillah bi amwalihim wa anfusihim azamu darajatin indallah wa ulaika humul faizun. So these are the people who believe and they leave their homes, they make jihad with their wealth and in person in the cause of Allah, have higher ranks in the sight of Allah. It is they who will be truly successful. Remember, whenever we talk about jihad, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always mentions fi sabilillah. Jihad is not for your personal gain. Jihad is not something that you decide to do. You always have to go by the system that has been created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? Because the people who are not Muslims, they are also creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah ta'ala wants to give them ample times, ample chances to improve themselves. We come across so many people who spend such disastrous life and suddenly one day it clicks to them and they want to come back to this religion of peace. So that's why Allah Ta'ala wants to protect them, and Allah Ta'ala doesn't want anyone to take all the system in their own hand and have their own ways of dealing with it. Verse number 23 to 24 then talks about the maintaining this distance even with our own families if they are falling into those parameters. The family member who doesn't believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala categorically talks about where our loyalties should be residing and whom we should be following, what should be our priorities. There is a beautiful hadith in Bukhari in which the Prophet ﷺ said, "None of you have faith until I am more beloved to him than his children, his father, and all of the people around." And we also come across this story in which he was walking with Umar radhiyallahu anhu, and Umar radhiyallahu anhu said, "I love you dearly, Prophet ﷺ, but after myself." So the Prophet ﷺ reminded him, your faith, your iman is not complete until you love me more than anyone in your life. And Umar radhiyallahu anhu amazingly didn't even think for a second, within probably a microsecond or a millisecond, he said, I love you more than anyone, even myself, even my family. And the Prophet ﷺ smiled and said, now your faith is complete. Why? Because we take Quran, the word of Allah, as the theory. All the principles, all the SOPs have been given over here. And at the very same time, we take the life of the Prophet ﷺ as the practical demonstration of all the principles given in Quran. And that is why it is very important for us to have that kind of connection with the Prophet, to understand his life, to appreciate his life, and then try to apply it in our own life as well. Then we move down to verse number 37, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the attitude of these people. What they used to do was they would play around the sacred months. The sacred months had been given in which they were totally forbidden to pick up fights with one another. So they would either shift the day, they'll say, let's pretend this is this month and this month is like 3 months ahead, or they would say that let's give it another name, or let's delay something like that a month. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, don't play tricks like that, because your attitude is telling me what kind of personality you have and what kind of sincerity you have. Probably you don't even have any sincerity. Then we come on to verse number 40. A beautiful story has been put in over here, in which the Prophet ﷺ, when he migrated towards Medina, and his companion Abu Bakr Siddiq radhiyallahu anhu was with him. It's an amazing account of how they left Makkah and what kind of difficulties they faced on the way, and how protective the companion was about the Prophet ﷺ. And he was so worried and he was so concerned about the safety of the Prophet ﷺ. And at that moment, just in between, when he was not actually expressing his anxiety or fear about all the elements which were threat elements which were around, the Prophet ﷺ said to him, is yaqulu li sahibihi la tahzan inna allaha ma'ana, when he said, do not worry, Allah is with us. This is such a key element for all of us to understand. We are going through difficult times. We are going through the times when we feel like nobody. We are going through those times when we need advice from someone, but no one is actually around. Because a lot of things that we see related to the mental illness, or when you are feeling depressed, is when you feel like a nobody, when you feel like nobody is appreciating me, or when you feel like there is no one around for whom I can get connect to and take advice. So over here, in all these difficult times, this is a punchline for us. La tahzan, inna Allaha ma'ana. If you remember in your life, Allah is always there with me. So when He is always there with me, why do I have to worry? I need to put aside all my worries. He is inshallah going to help me. All I have to do is focus on the right principles. What are the practices that I have to adopt? So if Allah help them, then there is peace in your heart, and we can all feel that peace. Then we come down to the verses around verse number 42, in which now the hypocrites the hypocrite behavior has been talked about over here. Remember, in the Battle of Tabuk, they were looking for ways to postpone going for this expedition, and they were coming up one after the other to the Prophet ﷺ with excuses. Now the Prophet ﷺ is so kind-hearted. He could see through those people that they were coming up with excuses. Remember, he knew who the hypocrites were. The list had been given to him by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, though he did not expose them. And when they would come up with all these excuses, the Prophet would look down or look the other way and just let them live with those excuses, giving them another time till they can see what's the outcome of the whole expedition and who benefits from it. And so all these different scenarios and different people, how they behaved in that time when the Battle of Tabuk was around, all of that has been talked about over here. And then we come down to verse number 55, in which it has been told that when they had the best of the world, and what they wanted was, they didn't want to improve themselves. Ultimately, it comes down to verse number 51, where say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, have tawakkul in Allah. You also need to look very closely at verse number 60, which is about the commandments of zakat. What are the categories for where your zakat is applicable? So I would highly advise you look into Surah Tawbah, open some tafsir, and read this verse number 60, because especially in the month of Ramadan, people are concerned about it. So we come down to verse number 66. Again, it is the talk of hypocrites, how they are worried that what if people find out that now we are hypocrites because the things are changing, and the Prophet ﷺ is getting more strict about the domestic and the local policy. It's like they were concerned about any form of WikiLeaks coming around for them, which actually did. They were being exposed in those times. And then we also find out in verse number 92 to 93, very beautifully, there were people among the same community with hypocrites, with enemies, with mushrikeen, who were genuine, but for genuine reason they were not able to engage in this expedition of Tabuk, and they were taking more pressure than the rest of the people, and they were also repeatedly coming to the Prophet seeking help that maybe we did something wrong. And this is like a very natural kind of a behavior I have also seen in the community. Sometimes you are trying to explain some issue that is happening around in your class or in your organization, and the people who are the problem makers, they never take the impact, but the people who are genuine, they would always come up to you and ask you if we are the ones who are creating this trouble. So over here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala advised them, or through the Prophet ﷺ, that no, Allah understands that they are genuine, and Allah understands that they are truly working for the cause, and they wanted to put in their share, and inshallah Allah will reward them for that. So as we come towards the end of this 10 shows, I'm hopeful that you would have understand this Surah Tawbah, the central theme, which is around the commandments of jihad, then their regulations about hypocrites, the people with the weak faith, the people who are into the idol worshipping, who had always been the enemies of the Muslim, and what are the struggles of the Muslims, and what are the learning outcomes from all these. Basically, it's the time of courage, it's the time of having some policies, it's a time of moving on, so that the message of the Islam and the beauty of Islam can be regularized, which is an important parameter for everyone. So with this, we find out that there are going to be people who will be genuine. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about reward for them. There are people who will come up with the valid excuses and they would be accepted. But there are also people who have sealed hearts. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about them at the very last verse of this juz 10, that وَطَبَعَ اللَّهُ عَلَى قُلُوبِهِمْ فَهُمْ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ, that Allah has sealed over their hearts so that they do not know. Why did Allah seal their heart? They never tried to use their heart for the purpose it was supposed to be. So we find out that today we are going through this hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ said, the thing I fear most for my ummah is the eloquent hypocrite. So it's not just hypocrite, eloquent hypocrite. And remember, the hypocrites, they cheat, they lie, they create mischief, and they break their covenants. So we need to keep watch on ourselves, the state of our heart, and also have clarity on our religion, that all the messages that are conveyed through our deen are still peaceful. Even when there is a warning in any of these messages, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala still is telling us that we have to be doing things in a peaceful manner. So with this, we finish off our verse for today, and I'm hopeful that inshallah you would have understood these messages. Let's finish off with our dua. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.